Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of our SANS OSINT live stream. If you are joining us, definitely we would like to include you in the conversation. If you have some questions, feel free to drop those and we'll try to address them if they are relevant or maybe even if they're irrelevant. Joining me today, I have my SANS Sec 587 Advanced OSINT course co-author, Nico Dekens.
Hey, everybody.
We also have Matt Edmondson, who is a SANS instructor and who has also presented on OSINT and automation at SANS OSINT summits and elsewhere. Finally, we have Justin Seitz, who many of you, I'm sure, already know. He is a luminary in the field of OSINT, automation, developer of the Hunchley tool. He's written books, taught classes. Justin, welcome to the live stream.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and get started here. First, I think we want to cover, what are we talking about when we are discussing automation for OSINT? That sounds like a pretty broad field, and it is. But Justin, why don't you kick us off here? Maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, and then we will discuss, first off, what the heck we're even talking about when we're talking OSINT.
Sure. Yeah. So my background's in cybersecurity. I worked in offensive cybersecurity for a number of years, writing exploits, reverse engineering, penetration testing, all that fun stuff. As I kind of got into some social engineering work, I realized that I really enjoyed the OSINT part. And even in a traditional red team or pen testing engagement, I really like the open source intelligence part of it. We leveraged automation to, harvest information on companies and people before we would kind of launch our attacks. And, largely that kind of drove me towards doing more and more open source intelligence. And I felt like there was a lot more impact I could have by, looking at problems like terrorism, human trafficking, and other things from the OSINT kind of lens as opposed to the more cyber lens. I'm sure that gets into more of a religious or philosophical debate, whether there's more effect from cyber than there is in OSINT in those things. So yeah, that's how I kind of ended up going out, starting a company with my wife and in 2015 and, really focusing on OSINT, training people how to write tools, how to approach some of these automation problems. And ultimately, we developed Hunchley as well along the way, which is kind of the anti-hero to automation in that it requires a human to drive it. So,
Right. Well, I mean, obviously you're not going to take humans out of the loop entirely, right?
never.
But let's talk a little bit more about how do we really automate? What are some of the use cases for OSINT automation? Like you alluded to, okay, you're harvesting information, say, on an organization that you're targeting as a red teamer. What are some examples of how you might do that?
Yeah, so I think, automation takes a ton of different forms, right? When you run a multi-go transform, that is a form of automation because it's not you having to actually go out and retrieve information about Bitcoin transactions or domain who is or whatever it might be. Particularly when we were doing social engineering, in one case I can think of, we were targeting a large financial, and we had discovered a huge part of their employee base was available through this directory, and it was online so that people could find a financial advisor for anywhere in the United States, right, within their local zip code. Because we'd actually done consulting at this company before, what we also realized is they had mapped from their Active Directory, they had actually mapped employee IDs into the website. Now, if you didn't have some of that in kind of knowledge, you wouldn't have known that. But what we were able to do is effectively write a scraper that went out and pulled every single one of these people down and pulled, including pulling out their internal employee ID. Because then when we ring the help desk, of course, we would say, hi, it's, Nico Dekens. I need to do a password reset. And they would say, well, what's your birthday? If we were lucky, we were able to find that via LinkedIn, Facebook, or whatever. And then, if we failed a question, inevitably they would ask, okay, well, what's your employee ID? And then we would give it to them. And then that would allow us to get through that kind of flow chart on the help desk and get password resets. So it was a perfect example of where we could have gone and manually, like one by one, pulled each one of these. But really what we needed is a way to kind of gather thousands and then run secondary scrapers to see if we could figure out birthdays and create this kind of funnel of information until we had a spreadsheet of stuff that was really good targeted use cases where we could get some wins, particularly in those social engineering gigs.
I think when it comes to automation and OSINT, it really depends on the goal, right? Because there's tons of things we still can or probably sometimes should do manually just because you have full control and you know exactly what's going on. But sometimes that's something that I see a lot, that people are looking for OSINT on scale or scalability, and they go out on GitHub and they find someone else's tool script and they simply fire it off with even asking questions. Hey, what's inside the script? What is it communicating to? What is it doing? It's collecting all the things, but they don't know. Well, it may impose an operation security risk for them because it may be communicating somewhere, or it may be sending out a device fingerprint or a user agent that you and your mission do not feel comfortable with. So
Yep.
I think, but also simple automation for me is, for example, using wget, a command line tool, to simply retrieve all the PDF documents from a domain or all the pictures from a domain. Of course, I can do it manually, but it just speeds up my processes and everything.
Or even older tools like the harvester, and all these sort of things where you can just kind of set it and it'll grab some stuff. And to your point there, Nico, you need to understand these tools. You need to understand what are their gaps, where they're going to miss things, and also the OPSEC piece where I grabbed this thing off GitHub, but I haven't maybe checked it and seen if it's reporting back to whoever put there what I'm searching for and things like that. So you definitely need to go into this with your eyes open and make sure you understand your tools if you're using other people's stuff instead of just writing your own code, for example.
I
Yeah.
think that makes it challenging. Wouldn't you agree, Justin? Because looking at, for example, the people I teach OSINT or that I come across in conferences, on average, most OSINT investigators or analysts are definitely not developers. I think the vast majority are not that good at programming and coding. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I would say that in my experience, yes, like as a baseline, their training is different than, it's not going to teach you coding. That's not kind of what analysts and investigators are genuinely trained up to do, right? So they're very good at chasing breadcrumbs and, really putting together cohesive research, but coding's not necessarily part of it. Now, that being said, I've trained a lot of people that had never, touched code before and are able to kind of turn around and start writing their own tools. I think that, to kind of follow up on, just running someone else's tooling as well, is that you can run into ethical issues where one person, the way their ethics, or even the country they live in, the laws that govern them, might be vastly different than your kind of ethical framework, or the laws that govern you. And if you just kind of blindly pull a tool down, / run it, and it spews out results without being able to actually kind of validate how it's doing that, or at least have an understanding of it, you may be breaking the law, or you might be putting yourself in a position where you can't even use the findings in the report you're writing. So I think there's also the secondary kind of thing where learning a bit of code, at least even some basic Python or some other, coding languages, at a minimum, being able to kind of read through some of the tools, or at least try to understand what they're doing, is a good thing. Because certainly I think even automated tools that we all use, commercial tools, the trick is really that whatever you run in an automated sense should be reproducible manually, right? You should be able to demonstrate how, if you ran a transform or you run some harvesting script, that you can go out and validate with your browser or in some manual steps. Here's exactly how I could have got this data one by one. Okay, that makes sense. Now I can explain it to a court, or I can put it in the report that I'm writing. But if you can't do that, and that's certainly happened to all of us here, where you run a piece of code, it tells you, hey, I've got these 10 results. You go try to validate it in your browser, and you can't get those results. I mean, that's a huge problem, right? And particularly if you're in law enforcement, that's a serious problem, because you that won't stand up in court, right? You'll get annihilated if you're questioned on it. So I think there's a lot of interesting cross section between kind of the tool runners, people who are trained to run tools, the people who are writing them, and being able to kind of live halfway in between, at least, is really is pretty crucial.
Absolutely. I think ethics and John on the live stream here brought a question up about that, which I think you've covered a little bit. What is legal? What is beyond legal, ethical to use? And that's something that kind of everyone's going to have to work out for themselves with their organizations, or what kind of work they're doing. Going back a little earlier to something you talked about, which is people that are not familiar with automation. They're not familiar with coding at all. Their background is in law enforcement, maybe as a street cop or something, and then they got into doing research on dark web or fraud or what have you. You've been teaching for a while, Justin. You've written books about this. What do you think are some of the ways that people with no real experience in automation, that are, OSINT researchers, OSINTers, how can they kind of get their feet wet with it? How can they introduce themselves to this?
Yeah, I think there's a handful of ways. One is, picking a programming language that's not exceedingly difficult, right? And this is why I steer people to Python, because it is the easiest to pick up and learn. It's the closest to written English, that you'll find in a programming language. And it's intuitive. It's kind of easy to read, right? It's easy to kind of write and read. And even not necessarily, like, don't go out and buy a Python, programming book that's 800 pages and is going to teach you all of this crazy stuff about, threading and whatever else. Really, like, find a resource that resonates with you. A good one is actually Automate the Boring Stuff, which is totally free, by Al Sweigart, and also available from No Starch. But it will take concepts like interacting with spreadsheets or other things that you already kind of intrinsically know, you understand what you're doing and why it's kind of important, or you have some experience with it, and start there. It's a really simple way to kind of go, okay, like, I can learn how to do these basic tasks that kind of are things that you're familiar with, and then being able to kind of break that out into, all right, now I want to, talk to the Twitter API, or I want to be able to write a web scraper, or whatever it might be. But really starting with something that is simple and that kind of resonates with you internally, or something that you can latch onto. I tend to tell people to avoid, like, I know a lot of folks kind of will grab books about, like, I want to learn Python via game development or something. It sounds fun and interesting, but the reality is that you're not really going to use a ton of that over in the OSINT world, or in forensics, or that kind of thing, right? And not all automation is necessarily writing crawlers or writing scrapers. Sometimes, not long ago, I had to write some automation to deal with a large data breach, right? So it was just a matter of, like, dealing with these massive files and countless documents and all of this stuff. It never touched the internet once, but was a form of automation that allowed me to kind of pull out pieces that I needed from it to go and investigate. So start simple, start small, start with something that kind of resonates with you, and that will make your life a lot easier.
Yeah. One thought that I sort of tell people is, hey, what is the problem you have where there's a scale issue or something? Like you said, going through some data, trying to normalize some data, or, hey, I need to try to grab all these email addresses or whatever, and take a look at how maybe you could automate that. Right?
Yep. Yeah. I've always tried to steer people towards Python for the same reasons that Justin said, but also for the reason of it's so popular. And I say that not because you're trying to be cool, but when you run into a problem, there's hundreds of other people that have run into that same problem. They've asked it on
Stack
Stack
Overflow.
Overflow. 38 people have chimed in with an answer. 4 of those answers are actually helpful. And then you're kind of back up and running, you know, without trying to wait on an answer. Whereas if you run into a problem in Go or something, a lot of times you feel like you're on your own. So,
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and
Read
also
on
I
all
think
that.
when it starts with starting to code, you need to have time and tenacity, and that's what I see a lot of people that really want to dive into learning. Well, for example, Python, and they want to be, let's say, a very skilled Python coder in a week, and that's impossible. It takes time, it takes hands-on practice, it takes trial and error. Of course, you can follow a course that will learn you the fundamentals and basics in a couple of days or in a couple of weeks, but it takes time. Just as open source intelligence by itself, of course, we can teach you in a week certain things, but now you need to put it to practice to really, really get it into your muscle memory and in your system. And I think that's something that people tend to overlook when they start to dive into that ambition. Hey, now I want to develop something, or I want to learn how to do that. So that's something. Yeah. Oh, and one comment came in. I just want to chip in that law enforcement, if we train our staff to code, they will go elsewhere for more money. Well, start paying them more. That's I've been in law enforcement for just under 25 years, and I see people go away because of the money. This is why governments need to step up their game, because the landscape is shifting. You need to have in-house developers and coders, and
Not only
they need money. They need money. That's what they earn. That's what developers they earn a little bit more money on average than, let's say, a street cop.
And the alternative to not paying your people to do things better is then you have people that don't know how to do things better, right?
Well, and the other problem, at least here in Canada, and hopefully there's some Canadian law enforcement people listening to this, is stop taking your trained forensics people, your trained cyber investigators after 3 or 5 or 6 years and sticking them back in patrol cars, because that's why they're leaving. And I know cyber teams and others across Canada here, like, of course, why wouldn't you leave? You've spent how many years training and doing what you want to do, and then your organization says, oh, well, you're, this position now, you got to rotate out, it's time to go back to patrol. I mean, I would go work for a tech company too. Why do that? And I spoke about this at a conference up here in Canada a few years ago, and I said, like, you got to stop doing this. Fast forward 2 or 3 years, and here we are. I'm still talking to teams that are losing police officers or losing team members, because as soon as they come back and say it's time to go back to patrol, they're like, no, I'm out. Right. And then all of that institutional knowledge is gone. All of that experience, all that training walks out the door. And it's such a backwards, strange way of doing things, but it's really ingrained, at least in a lot of our forces up here, to do that. Never figured it out. So hopefully some people are listening to this up here, at least in Canada, and this is going to create a major problem for cybercrime and other investigators in high tech if we continue to do that. So
I blame Canada.
Yeah, blame Canada. It's set all the bad trends.
This is the problem, especially in government, probably all over the world, right?
Yeah.
I like to think so. So something different. So when we talk about automation, most people will start talking about let's say programming languages in general. So what's your opinion for each and every one of you who wants to answer on, let's say, tools that are already out there to automate stuff? You have Aleph, for example, the OCCRP tool that can do certain automating tasks. Well, even Hunchly, of course, I need to browse manually, but afterwards it already has automated for me all the labels and all those things. Maltego, very popular. What's your vision on that, especially looking at some of the questions where people saying, hey, when we have automation and versus an analyst, how does it work?
I'll tell you from my point of view, what before I ever got into OSINT, I was doing a lot of work with stats and maps and GIS, without a whole lot of training. And a lot of the queries that I would run, because I was pulling from data sources that I didn't have direct control over, these reports would literally take hours to run as I'm sitting there writing the code. And so I would be a sucker if I if I kind of came in the morning and pushed that button and then sat there and waited for 3 hours. And so I would set things up. It was banging off at 3, 4 in the morning. Then I would come into work, review the results, make sure everything looked good, and sent it out. So for me, even before I got into OSINT, automation was just like kind of ingrained in me. You know, when you're like a one-person shop trying to take care of all these things, automation is the only way to survive. And so I basically learned to code, not because I wanted to learn how to code, out of necessity. And now you see some of these plugins out there, like Instant Data Scraper, for instance, and it's like, oh, this is fantastic, right? Like if I need to write a scraper that needs to run every day, every week, then yeah, I don't mind writing the scraper and taking the time. But if I just need to do something as this type of one-off, then, you know, then yeah, you have tools like that just make it so easier for you. So no, I'm a big fan of the tools that automate it. Just, I know Justin touched on it earlier too. You just kind of validate the results. You know, I've been testing a lot of tools lately, and then you go to check it and it's like, you know, this just isn't getting exactly what I thought it would be able to get. Then you dive into the code and try to figure out the reasons and what's going on. You know, something that I talk a lot about with digital forensics is it's not the tool that's up on the stand when you go to testify. You know, it's not Cellbrite that's sitting up there. It's you explaining what you did. It's you explaining what's going on. And so you need to be able to kind of manually validate that, manually be able to replicate that. But the tools are fantastic. I'm a huge fan of them.
And understand it to the level where you can explain it. You know,
100%.
Yeah.
Let me flip. Go ahead, Nico.
No, I just wanted to pop in that question that came in on where John Frey asks if we have any ideas or best practices could also be for running tabletops in your own team to get everyone on the same page on how to know what automation is doing for you versus the value added of the analyst work. So anything that from your side, Justin?
I have done, I'm probably the least experienced in doing tabletop stuff here. So I'm going to defer to either Matt or John or you to talk about that one.
Okay, I'll take a shot. So I remember vividly when I was in law enforcement, simply because just like Matt, 9 out of 10 times I was a one-man show for certain counterterrorism-oriented tasks. And they wanted me, for example, to monitor certain individuals, a group of individuals. Well, they were in different time zones that I was in. They were very active. Some were not so active. They had social footprints online almost everywhere on every platform. So that required me to put in a lot of manual work. And I simply sat down with the team and team leader say, hey, you're giving me these goals, but I like to sleep every now and then. Yeah, for real. And I also have other things that I'm responsible for. I would like to, let's say, hire a developer for a couple of days. I will tell them exactly what I need because, hey, I know some code, but when I start coding, it will probably take me way too much time, and I will not be that efficient as, let's say, someone who really studied for it. So give me a developer for a couple of days. I will tell them exactly what needs to be done, what kind of output I need that I can work with as an OSINT analyst. And cost effective, that will save you tons of time because now I can do all those tasks in, let's say, a day versus me being busy for 2 weeks. And you can do the math money-wise. And I think showing those proof of concept kind of things. So sometimes I just went rogue and I just reached out to the developer and say, hey, whip me something up. I need to prove a point. And that helped. But of course, that will not work for everybody. You could be sacked. You could lose your career for doing such things. But hey, I was just willing to take the risk.
So don't necessarily follow Nico's advice.
Like always.
Yeah. Sometimes you need to.
I don't know that I've done this as like an official tabletop, but I definitely think it makes sense periodically to kind of review what automated tools you're using, how you're using automation, maybe ways you can do it better, and maybe even ways that it's not working well. You know, maybe it just doesn't work well at all. You get a lot of false positives and things. Like maybe it's just better to have more humans in the loop there sometimes.
Yeah, I've never really done that. I've done tabletops for other topics. I've never really done a table talk on this. It's just about maintaining close communications with the rest of your teammates. if you are working on your team, you know, as a from being when it was a one-person deal, I knew exactly what I needed. And also, like, you know, Nico's talking about, hey, it's not going to cost us much money. I was in environments where we basically had no budget. And if there was some capability that I wanted, I either had to write it myself or do without it if there wasn't a free option. But then at that kind of transition, and you go from being a one-person shop to building a team and taking on analysts and other things, then all of a sudden now it transitions to where instead of the one who's doing all the work, you're the one who's helping out everyone else. And I just, you know, one of the main things I had to focus on was trying to make sure that I was working very, very closely with my teammates to find out what are their pain points. And here's someone, it's like, oh, I spent the last 3 days doing this. And it's like, is this something you're going to have to do a decent amount? All right, let me automate this for you. Like, let's actually write something and kind of do that. So it was more just about, you know, making people aware sometimes of a little bit of what the capabilities are, and just more about communication and keeping those lines open and trying to help people identify, you know, where their pain points are and what you can do to kind of help out with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the other way around, also pointing out the limitations, because I remember when people started figuring out, hey, that Nico guy knows people that can automate stuff, so he can speed up his tasks. And now they basically ask you for download the internet because then we know everything. Yeah. And I'm like, hey, well, there are some limitations to automation because there's still humans that need to look at the final outcome and all that kind of stuff. But also some tools simply have certain limitations, especially when it comes to open source intelligence, because it still needs to be information that comes from open sources, right?
So let me throw this out there. What are maybe some of the drawbacks to automation? You know, what are maybe some of the gotchas that the people new to it aren't thinking about?
There are many. I mean, I think all automation should be driven from reproducible manual steps that you then want to turn over to a computer. You shouldn't start in the opposite order. So not starting with, like, as Nico said, download the internet. It's that reproducible manual steps and steps that, you know, work and you can do over and over and over again by hand. And then there's these, you know, so many pitfalls where you, again, even that data breach example where there's tens of thousands of documents and you're processing all of them, but there's some small error in your code and it's skipped about 100 of them, and you don't know until much later when you're kind of hunting through stuff, and then you realize, oh, wait a second, you know, this you know, I'm missing these 100 PDFs or whatever it is. And I guess for experienced practitioners, you know enough to go and sanity check that. Like, you are checking these things. You're looking for problems like that. You're looking for discrepancies in file counts, for example. But if you're kind of new to it and you don't realize that these are common problems, then you kind of run off with that data and you've actually missed a big chunk, or you've missed some crucial information. And, you know, ultimately, I think at the end of the day, automation or no automation, we're all report writers. At some level, you have to discuss your results, right?
Yeah.
Whether you're in CTI, forensics, law enforcement, a journalist is writing a report. Everybody is a report writer. That is your end destination. So I think the huge pitfall is just like running a tool and not realizing that it's got problems or it's missed things, and then you take your findings and you just run off to report writing. And the worst part is that generally when you're writing reports, at least in a kind of a hierarchical organization where there's a command structure, is that the higher it goes up, the less technical those people are, right? So once you propagate that information up, the sanity checks get even further and further away from the data, meaning those people can't actually validate those results either.
And
So
they're relying on it possibly more because they're
well,
not
they have
good
to.
at that.
That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah, exactly. So I think that that's where those dangers lie in these automated techniques, is just always keeping in the back of your mind that I need to be able to validate and explain this manual process, and I need to sanity check the results, right? And there's a variety of ways of doing that, but I think that's a big gotcha that I've seen firsthand.
Yeah. And depending on what you're automating too, you always run into the need for upkeep potentially.
Yeah.
You know, like when you're sitting there dealing with a site like Twitter, which gives a great API and it's documented, you write your code and the code is usually rock solid. Then you go to deal with Facebook, which basically never had a decent usable API. And so you're into scraping and you're logging in and you're going around and you're doing all the things that you need to do. And you write some useful code that people love and people use it all over the place and everything's great until 3.5 months later, it's like, oh, there's a problem, right? Because something changed. Right, Facebook changed the way something is named. They changed something, and so now it's you got to stop what you're doing, and immediately, you know, you built this tool that's amazing that people depend on, but now you need to stop what you're doing and try to go fix that. You know, so it definitely, like I said, depending on what you're automating, there's can definitely be a an obligation for some upkeep there as well.
And we find that a lot in OSINT, right? Because we're collecting stuff from the interwebs. And like you said, Facebook changes one setting, all of a sudden it's broken. Google changes how it does a search, all of a sudden it's broken.
Yeah, it's just, for example, those simple username lookup tools where they simply do a small timeout. So you do the search. So you search for hundreds and hundreds of social media platforms to see if a username is claimed or taken. But every now and then, one of these platforms blocks you based upon a timeout request or a rate limiting or something like that. And you just assume, since the tool says, hey, finished, it ran through all those sources, but it may have skipped one or two without you even noticing those small little things. Or I've had examples where a username was so long that certain username lookup tools were unable to look up a very long username. So you assume that the tool works, but it simply doesn't work due to the way you input information or the amount of requests you do in a short amount of time. It's sometimes OSINT can be frustrating, I guess. A little bit. Yeah. So let me pop in a question that I think is a really interesting question coming from, well, I'm going to try and pronounce it right. Rokibul Islam Rani, who says, how do we know any OSINT or forensics tools are legal in a country or on a country if there's no law still available or concern from the government? How do the law enforcement or how would they take action on this kind of activity? Well, anyone want to take a shot on that?
I'll start there by saying if you're doing forensic stuff and using forensics tools of any sort, that sort of implies that you're going to be presenting that court doing something of a legal nature. You absolutely need to understand those tools, the legality of them. And that's going to vary by country and maybe even municipal or state province type jurisdiction. So we can't really give you the answer here, but absolutely check with your legal folks. If you're a one-man shop, get an attorney, right, that understands these things so that you do, A, totally understand the tool, and B, understand the laws where you are or where you're going to be operating.
Yeah, there have been a few forensics companies here in the United States that have done it, and they sell elsewhere too, that have done the industry a disservice by branding themselves as court certified, right? Oh, this is certified to use in court. And I'm not going to name and shame them. You know who you are. You know who you are. But I mean, seriously, that's like asking, it's ridiculous, right? Like, this is fantastic. Can you please give me a list of tools that are not court certified? Right? It's like asking, like, oh, the crime occurred in front of my house. Like, what cameras am I allowed to use to take pictures of the crime? Like,
definitely when you get into paid tools and marketing and things.
Exactly. Yeah.
Take all that with a grain of salt.
I use forensics tools in OSINT all the time. You know, Justin's talking about triaging large sets of data. There's a tool called Bulk Extractor. I've done a blog post on it and talked about it before that is fantastic for triaging large sets of data. I don't think forensics tools are usually going to get you into trouble. It's once again understanding how they work. What can get you into trouble, you know, is when you start getting into some of the automated reconnaissance tools. When you start going on that side, you know, when you start talking about actively poking at a site, you know, not just using Shodan or Census or some of those things, but a little bit some of the more aggressive tools like that. That's the one that can really, I think, kind of get you jammed up from a legal perspective. You know, because I mean, pen testing, first of all, you know, you're not doing anything. Justin knows this. You're not doing anything before you have signed documentation, you know, laying out exactly what you're allowed to do. And doing OSINT, you know, you most likely don't have that. And so those are the tools where, once again, comes down to understanding how they work.
Yeah.
Well, there's one thing.
Scanning of any sort, you definitely want to make sure you understand the laws there.
Yep. 100%.
Yeah, and with OSINT, keep in mind when you start tracking down individuals or groups for a longer period of time, 9 out of 10 times you're invading their privacy a little bit more. So when you look at, for example, GDPR that we have over here in the EU, well, if I start looking at, for example, Justin, his Twitter for, let's say, longer than a week, and I do that 24/7, well, there may be prosecution office here in the Netherlands that says, well, we need to take a look at that because now you're really taking a look into his personal life. And especially if you're doing this with an automated tool, you could potentially see more than we actually are targeting him for. So those are things, especially when it comes to, for me, tools that look at people mostly, or individuals, or groups of individuals, or you can cross that boundary pretty quick. And also keep in mind, you will very often be poking outside of your own jurisdiction with those tools.
Right. And I think the other thing too, like from a reconnaissance perspective, is like, yeah, every country is different, and you definitely don't want to be the example case. You don't want your name to be part of case law because a prosecutor, and we've seen cases of this where aggressive prosecution services have gone after people for things that are completely nuts, right? Like reading the source code of a website is not a crime anywhere. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that someone can't charge you with stuff though.
Yep.
Right? Like
Especially
that's the
if they're
thing you have
not,
to remember.
especially if they don't understand it. And that a lot of times prosecutors and people doing that sort of work for the government don't understand these things. So someone comes to them with a complaint and you have a problem, even if what you're doing was legal. And that's where showing that you have talked to an attorney, having an attorney to help deal with this is important.
Yeah. And I think the other thing to remember too is often like, I think at some level it's you can look at the door, but you can't try the handle is really how most laws across most countries work. Right. So, years ago, people were really concerned with port scanning. I think it's been largely accepted that port scanning is not a crime, but I'm not a lawyer. So make sure you're checking your own jurisdiction. But you do get into these sticky areas where, let's say you port scan something and it's got an open service that's a camera. Your country, it might be totally fine to then say, well, I can just go watch that stream, right? I mean, it's open. You're not entering any passwords. You're not using an exploit. It's open data, right? An Elasticsearch server that's sitting open that you can just retrieve all its records, But again, I think the important part is how are you going to use that information, right? Like, are you going to take information that's coming off of a breached Elasticsearch server and then try to convince a judge in a case with it? Because that might be tough, right? Because the optics of how you obtained it don't look very good, all right? Which is not necessarily a legal problem. It's an argument problem, right? It's an optics problem. So it's always like, and I always tell people too, like, you have to think that what I'm going to take right now, would I feel comfortable explaining myself in front of a judge? Right? In any case, right? And if the answer is yes, then, and you've got legal approval, then go nuts. But if you have that little twinge in your stomach where you're like, ooh, I don't know, you should listen to that twinge in your stomach because it's probably right that you shouldn't do whatever you're about to do or pull information from devices that you shouldn't be pulling.
Yeah, I think it's the same with when you walk in the street, an average street somewhere, and you look in someone's window and you see, let's say, a bunch of confidential documents on a desk. The fact that you see them does not mean that you can read them, even more take photos of them, or aggregate the data from that and do something with it. It's there. You can just see it. That's it. That's open source. Open source is, hey, it's just available, but does not always mean that you are legally allowed to use or obtain the data.
Yeah, I think that's a key point, right? The collection might be legal, but what you're doing with it might not be legal. You're almost talking about, like, you could talk about doxing and other things like that. It's like, okay, collect that data. You could grab all this data, and if that's just for your own research, great. But maybe if you do something else with that, that's illegal. So,
So let me see. So here's someone asking, would something like Pemais, which is a tool that people, or if people don't know, that can do reverse image searches based upon their faces. It kind of comes close to where Clearview AI was known for. In this case, it's owned by an individual as well. The New Yorker did a very in-depth article about the people owning Pemais, but basically it's a tool that grabs someone else's faces from the internet, and you pay money to that tool, and it will automatically, so with in an automated way, start looking if it can find the exact same face or similar looking faces elsewhere on the internet. Now the question is, would that be an aggressive tool? Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Yep. And again, and I think that like some of the coverage in some of these facial recognition tools, I mean, and again, Clearview and Pemais are, I think they're different. They're different in a lot of ways. I think that, like anything, I see arguments around revenge porn and other things where Pemais and other tools really can just continually re-victimize people, because it is so tough to get once it's out there, it's so tough. And I know that was like a big part of some of the articles related to Pemais in recent time, was really a young woman who had been re-victimized continually because revenge porn and things that she did not consent to continued to pop up on the internet, and she was able to easily find these using Pemais. I think there's the reverse side of it where, with great power comes great responsibility. And I also see applications for this to, close cases that might have not otherwise been closed. To use these tools in ways that can definitely find victims, can find things that you're just not going to find any other way. So it's hard, right? I mean, a lot of this stuff, when we get into privacy and ethics, it's this huge kind of gray area from a legal perspective and also a context perspective, right? I think if you frame it like I use a tool to stalk women and make sure I can find their revenge porn, clearly there's an ethical problem. But using the exact same tool to find victims of a perpetrator, or to find trafficked or individuals who have been victims of crimes in other ways.
Yeah.
That ties back to the legal stuff there. It's about intent, right?
Well, and that's really what a lot of the law is about, is intent.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right.
I will say too, we've been talking a lot about the legality of different things. And one thing that I was trying really, really hard to avoid was, when you're an individual, you're worried about legality. When you're working for like a government organization, law enforcement organization, or any company, you're not only worried about legality, you're worried about policy. And I know for a lot of us on the law enforcement government side, the policy is more restrictive than the laws are in a lot of cases, right? And that gets very, very frustrating for people working, like, hey, what do you mean? I'm not allowed to do this with my job, but my spouse back home, just sipping coffee, like can do this. Like it can be kind of infuriating. A lot of times with like Clearview, for instance, it's not even that you're not legally allowed to work with them. It's just by policy, because of some of the things that happen to where like no one's working with them at this point. So just one thing to keep in mind. But that's, like I said, if you're working for an organization, that's definitely something to keep in mind too. It's not just a matter of legality. It's also a matter of what's allowed by policy.
And there are gray areas there too. If you are doing work, for example, for a government organization as a PI, I used to get warned, in training sessions and stuff. If you're being deputized, the rules are different now than if you're just a regular private investigator. So understand some of those rules for your clients and things, because they might now be applicable to you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think when you look back at this conversation, I think my takeaway would be from this: when you want to automate, it takes time to learn how to automate stuff yourself with learning how to code, and you simply cannot learn that in a short amount of time. If you're going to use someone else's tool that's publicly available, for example, on GitHub or something like that, take your time to read the code and understand the code and see what it does, what the risks are, what it's capable of, what it's not capable of. And I think the conclusion is that when we are doing OSINT, 9 out of 10 times it's, hey, can I? Yes. May I? Maybe not. Agree? Yeah. Should I?
Should I?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
What I will say too is even if you can't much, even if you don't feel really comfortable in your coding skills, just testing stuff. Recently reviewing some tests of a very, very popular tool that is designed to look at a website and download a lot of files, and you start comparing that with the results of Google Docs and certain things, and like, what the heck? Like, this isn't grabbing so many things that it should be grabbing.
I like to run competing tools, and you can see that output, or write your own stuff and then look at some tool that's out there on GitHub and like, okay, let's compare these. What's happening?
Yeah, just because you don't feel like you're comfortable reviewing the code doesn't mean that you still can't and shouldn't test these different things through methods like that. So,
All right, final thoughts. Anyone have anything?
My final thought would be is that we will see automation grow and grow more in the coming years, simply because the internet is becoming so widely spread, so scalable, more, let's say, less statical text and more video, for example, which brings new challenges for OSINT investigators to analyze all the footage and all the audio and all the speech and such. So yeah, we need automation, but we need to educate our people. And if we want to have good people, hey, they cost money, and otherwise they will go away to different companies. That's how it works nowadays.
Yeah, I think the more powerful tools, like we're talking about the AI and the facial recognition stuff, it's definitely getting into some areas where these things are so powerful they can do some pretty bad things. So be aware of what you're doing. Like, be good. Use these things correctly. Try to follow the rules and make sure you're doing things for the right reasons. Cool.
Matt, are you going next?
Matt, you got something for us?
Go ahead, Matt. I'll go last.
Oh no, yeah. I just want to say thanks for having me. This has been a blast. So it's good to see you all. It's all three of you. I generally don't care for a ton of people, but all three of you are people that I wish I genuinely got to see a lot more of. So thanks for inviting me. This is a fun topic, and I had a good time. So thank you.
Likewise.
Justin.
Yeah, likewise for me too. Thank you so much for having me. And definitely, automation's here to stay. My faith is still in humans. We are the best at this work. No script, AI, machine learning model, or anything else is going to replace a well-trained, tenacious analyst. So just remember that our jobs are very secure in this realm. A computer will never beat us in that regard. So, and definitely feel free to reach out to me if you're looking to get started in coding. Just reach out, and I'll try to point you at some resources.
Fantastic. Thank you to everyone who joined us on the live stream. We'll see you on the next episode, and have a great day. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.